What you are about to hear is not a podcast. This is a global conversation recorded live in real time with real people.
Journalists,
business leaders,
academics, politicians. I think the term's a deep state. Oh dear.
investors,
Experts, diplomats.
citizens.
Coming together from around the world to share their views and ask our guests the questions. If you would like to join this conversation or hear our incredible library of past conversations, please visit our website, pm101.club, and join the fastest growing conscious community on the free internet. Thanks for being here.
Enjoy
the show. Hey everyone, welcome back to Politics and Media 101. I'm Jeff Browning, and if you listen to our first few episodes, then you know that over the last few months, my friend Justin Higgins and I and our friends have convened hundreds of conversations, sometimes more than once per day, with up to 30,000 live listeners and participants, where we all hear live and direct from people in the news, in their own voices, in their own words, in long form, and where anyone who wants to can join to ask them a question, share their thoughts, or just listen. We're just now starting to release recorded portions of our live conversations for the first time, and we're grateful to you for joining us. Today, we're very excited to release part of a conversation, interview, and audience Q&A we had with Congressman James Clyburn from South Carolina. The House of Representatives is a fiery place. It has more than 400 members, each of whom represents a small corner of the country, and more often than not, those corners of the country disagree about where we all should go as a nation in terms of policy. In order for most things to pass into law, they have to get 218 votes in the House of Representatives, a simple majority. Right now, Democrats control 220 votes. That means that on any given day, if 3 people in this group of 220 disagree, then the wheels of government, in a way, stop turning. Congressman Clyburn is the 3rd highest ranking Democrat in the House of Representatives, and specifically, his job on the House leadership team is to talk to every member of the Democratic caucus, find out what's important to them, and figure out a way for everyone to agree. So when they do vote on things, at least 218 members vote yes, and there are enough votes for Congress to get things done. Right now, Congress is considering some pretty big pieces of legislation on roads, bridges, ports, housing, internet infrastructure, railroads, and other sectors that could use reinvestment. But there are big fault lines of disagreement in the caucus and in the country over how much we should spend on these investments and what they should be. There are few people who are better qualified to speak to where we fall short, where we should go, and where we can go as a country than Congressman Clyburn. He speaks from 50 years of experience. He's witnessed many key events in our country's history. He was first elected president of his local NAACP youth chapter at age 12. He was active in the civil rights movement. It was a great conversation with awesome audience questions, and we hope you enjoy it as much as we did. As always, if you like or dislike what you hear, if you want to find out how to join us live almost every day of the week, maybe ask one of our upcoming guests a question, or hear past episodes, please visit our website, pm101.live or pm101.club. They both work and will get you to the same place where you can find all that and more. Without any further ado, let's roll the tape. You're in the middle of a huge legislative initiative in the House right now. It's the time for counting votes and putting pressure on members. So can you tell us about your job, the whip? You know, we all know that you're the 3rd highest ranking member of the Democratic Party in the House. You play a really key part in the leadership team. So what's the job of the whip on a day-to-day level at a time like this?
Well, on a day-to-day level, the job of the whip is to stay in as close contact with the members of the caucus that I possibly can, to interact with as many of not just my constituents, but constituents from around the country as I possibly can. And then to do as I did this morning, spend about 30 minutes on the phone with Speaker Pelosi, offering my advice as to how I think we could move this agenda forward. And then when all of that's said and done, my job is to go when the bill comes to the floor to do what is necessary to get the 218 votes we need to pass the legislation. And I'm doing all I can to get us to a good place.
So if you're in a situation where you have 217 votes and you need to get to 218 for a majority. But maybe you have a particularly difficult holdout for members where positive incentives aren't resonating. How do you go about getting those last votes?
Well, it all depends on what's keeping that one member from coming along. If it's because of some wording in the legislation, you sit down with the other members in the Rules Committee when necessary to see can you reword things to accommodate that. Well, sometimes it is because there's something there that the member is finding a real difficulty with in the bill, and you see whether or not that one issue that's causing the problem can be dealt with sometimes. Can you live with the legislation, or can the 217 live with taking that out? Or should we put something in? And can the 217 live with that? So there's just a plethora of things that you do. Sometimes, and I've seen this, it was just, you need to put a period rather than a comma.
It's a beautiful collaborative process. When I worked in the House, I always really appreciated it, and you have such a fascinating role in it. But, over the trajectory of your career, how did you come to be the whip, the Democratic Party? Did you envision, when you started your congressional career in 1993, that this was a job that you would one day have?
No, I didn't. I don't know if I ever really thought about that. I did know that being in the Congress was a job I wanted to have since my preteen years. I really started paying close attention to politics when I was only 8 years old. I was 8 years old when Harry Truman was elected president of the United States. And because of the rules in my house on reading the Bible, to do Bible verses every morning, and to read the newspaper so I could report current events to my parents every evening, I would just grew up in this whole process. My dad was a minister who spent a lot of time training me for leadership, though I think he was more interested in my being a minister leading the church than where I am today. But he told me that when I first told him I didn't think I was going to go to the seminary, as we had talked about, he told me that he suspected the world would much rather see a sermon than to hear one. And that's what I try to do. Whatever I do, I try not to disappoint my dad, who was not disappointed when I told him that I would not follow him into the ministry. So though I didn't see my role as being whip, I did see myself being in the Congress itself.
I know a lot of folks in the audience now have been following the big pieces of legislation that are in the air. There's a bipartisan infrastructure package. There's a larger package that Democrats are putting together that contains a lot of President Biden's agenda and the Democratic agenda. And Democrats have been working hard to get the message out and talk to people about it. That said, I mean, we've seen some polling, polls, say what we will about polls, but polls suggest that only a quarter of the country really understands or says that their family would be better off if the two bills are passed. So I was wondering, do you think Democrats have failed to explain the bills to the public, or where has there been a breakdown in communication?
Well, the breakdown has been communication, and I've been saying that for some time, way back during the presidential. And I think that this is a problem that we have in the Democratic caucus, because we have a lot of very smart people in our caucus, dedicated people. But our caucus is so diverse until some members really are challenged when it comes to trying to get people to understand exactly what they feel and mean. And that's not unusual. I often refer to our caucus as a family. I stayed married to the same woman for 58 years. We stayed 58 years together, 3 children, 4 grandchildren, and we had a lot of disagreements. But we never, ever were unified. We were always, there was unity all the time. But that doesn't mean you aren't going to have disagreements. And so that's part of what I try to do in our caucus. Say, hey, this is a family situation here. No, we don't agree on what's best to do it, how best to do it, when it's best to do it. But let's see, can we find common ground? And so that's a real big job when you got a caucus that's 221 people, of which 56 are African Americans. And the backgrounds are different. You got Hispanics. We got, when it comes to religion, we have Christians, we have Jews, we've got Muslims, we got Buddhists. All these things make up a very diverse caucus. You don't have that at play in the Republican conference. We got, like I said, 56 African Americans. They got 2 on the other side, 2 African Americans. And so you can understand that. And even when you get within the African American community, I represent a lot of farmers. And I have to reconcile rural South Carolina with more urban South Carolina. And we have that within our caucus. And so I try to say to people, when it comes to something like broadband, for instance, that you mentioned, broadband has in itself differences from urban to rural. You've got about 25%, according to what I've been told, about 25% of the school children in New York City don't have broadband. They don't have it because that's an affordability problem, not accessibility. When it comes to rural South Carolina, we got a broadband problem because we have an accessibility problem rather than affordability. You know, if you're trying to run fiber through rural South Carolina, it's not that profitable to go from one house to the next when there's a big farm, a lot of farmland between the 2 houses. In New York, when they're stacked on top of each other, they don't have a problem with accessibility, but you have a lot of school children in families that cannot afford broadband. That's why when I offered my legislation, I call it accessible, affordable broadband for all. So these are the kinds of things that we have in our caucus, and to try to get people to understand that a Black person representing Bronx, New York, will have different challenges than a Black person representing, like I do, Allendale, South Carolina.
I know that the Democratic bill, the Build Back Better bill, and the bipartisan infrastructure bill have a lot of investments in them that target a lot of different members' districts. But as you mentioned before, you know, people in the public or in the audience may not have had a chance to hear about what's in the bills. So what do you think the public should know about what's in them? What do you want to tell the audience about what's in the bills and why you think they'll benefit?
Well, you know, I study history every day. I used to teach it. And I say that we ought to be informed about history. And let me give you an example. And I found this to be so true in my caucus a couple of weeks ago. I stood before my caucus and tried to tell them exactly why I felt so strongly about expanding Medicaid as opposed to expanding Medicare. And it goes to the history of Social Security. We've heard all the talk about how Social Security lifted so many elderly people out of poverty when it was initiated back in the 1930s. But when the Social Security came online, it did not cover domestic workers. It did not cover farm workers. And 65% of the Black people in this country at the time Social Security was put in place, 65% of African Americans were either domestic workers or farm workers. They all got left out of Social Security. Now, people didn't know that. I had so many members to come up to me after and say, I didn't realize that. And I'll tell you something else. When Social Security was put in place, the retirement age was set at 65. Go back and look at what the life expectancy for Black people back in the 1930s. It was 48. So you got 48 years as opposed to 65 years old. So that, to me, is what created these pockets of poverty throughout a lot of the communities that I represent. And so when I bring that kind of experience to our caucus, have those kinds of discussions, you'll be amazed at how many people says, I just never knew that to be the case. And so that's the same thing when it comes to Medicare. Medicare is for everybody if you turn 65 years old. You can be a multimillionaire and you get Medicare. Medicaid is for poor people. And so when you come to making a decision between a 35-year-old low-income head of household with 2 or 3 children without any health insurance, they need to have health insurance. So you're going to tell me, let's forego doing that, but instead, let's give more dental care and more vision and more hearing care to a millionaire that's on Medicare. That's the problem that we have that I'm trying to get people to focus on. And when I explain it to people that way, they say, I now understand. But it takes more of an explanation than you can do with a 4 or 5 second soundbite. And these 4 or 5 second sound bites that so many people on social media use to engender opposition to what we're trying to do. I get it all the time. A bunch of people came outside of my office calling themselves progressives and want to know why I didn't sign on to this bill. And then when you start talking to them, they don't even know what they're talking about. So that's the problem we have in the Democratic caucus. You don't have that problem so much in the Republican conference, but that's where we are.
I really appreciate your comments about Medicaid expansion. A lot of people may not understand how important Medicaid is for for children in schools, as you mentioned. And I know that sometimes state governments turn down additional resources for Medicaid. Why do you think that is? And is it a problem for Medicaid expansion when state governments don't cooperate or reject federal resources?
Absolutely, but it's the same thing that happened. It's because of the same reasons that we had them left out of Social Security. There are 12 states that have not expanded Medicaid. 8 of those 12 states, 8 are in the South. In these same Republican-controlled legislatures and governorships in the South that refuse to expand Medicaid have been denying this kind of health care to mostly Black people forever. The majority of Black people in this country still live in the South. But for some reason, every time we start talking about Black people, I hear them talking, well, the inner city this and the inner city that. Come on now. More Black people live in rural America than live in the inner city.
So I want to ask you about leadership in the House of Representatives. So, you've worked alongside Speaker Pelosi for a long time now. You've been her top lieutenant, passing a lot of pieces of legislation, working with her and Leader Hoyer. And I know that good teams usually have a mix of people with different leadership styles. I was wondering if you might want to explain to us or offer any examples of how your leadership style differs from that of Speaker Pelosi or Leader Hoyer.
Well, quite a bit, quite frankly. There are times when Speaker Pelosi and Leader Hoyer look to me to offer up an explanation because all of us, and I say this all the time. In fact, I don't know if you are privy to my memoirs. I call it Blessed Experiences. And I said in the introduction to that book that we are no more, no less than what our experiences allow us to be. And so Steny and Nancy have a different set of experiences from me. And I have a different set of experiences from them. And so I think we complement each other well. And I also said in this book that all of my experiences have not been pleasant, but I've considered all of them to be blessings. Now, Nancy nor Steny have ever had the kind of unpleasant experiences that I've had. Being Black in the South, neither one of them have had that kind of experience. I don't have the experience of being white in Maryland or being a white woman in San Francisco. So what we do, we sit around the table and we really try to complement each other as best we possibly can. And I think we do a pretty good job. And I say to people all the time, come on now, you don't expect us to see the world the same way. And some of this has got nothing to do with color. My wife and I were the same complexion, but we stayed married 58 years simply because we learned how to accommodate our backgrounds, which were totally different. I graduated from what we called in those days a boarding school. My wife went to high school walking 2.5 miles to school every morning and 2.5 miles back home every afternoon. When the black kids didn't have buses, school buses, when she was coming along in Berkeley County. And so my experiences were different from hers. And we found that out within the first few weeks of marriage. And so we made the accommodations that were necessary to stay successful in marriage for 58 years. So I'm not above or beyond making those kinds of accommodations. I try to do the same thing in our caucus. And I would hope that we get people to understand that. You know, I see people all the time that say, well, Jim Clyburn, you are moderate, and such a person is a progressive. Okay. Moderate people spend time in jail trying to get off the back of a bus. I met my wife in jail. We were students on the same campus, didn't know each other until the day I went to jail on March 15, 1961 or 60, when I first went to jail. And she came to jail to bring food. And that's when we met. So nobody in our caucus, there was one person in the caucus who had that kind of experience, and it was John Lewis. There's nobody in the caucus today that has had that kind of experience but yours truly.
So I want to pivot next to talk about messaging and about national races and House races. You mentioned how many different members there are in the House, how many different types of districts. One thing I always loved about working in the House is just how varied the members in the districts are. But from 2012 to 2020, I know a lot of working class voters, Black, white, and Latino, shifted to the GOP. There's data to suggest. So how do you think Democrats can improve campaigning or messaging to win those voters back?
The first thing I think we've got to do is learn how to trim the message. When I mentioned my dad teaching me for leadership skills, he used to say this to me, son, you lead by precept and example. Whatever precept you lay out, you be an example of that precept. Don't ask anybody to do anything that you won't do yourself. That was a very good lesson for me. But a second lesson that he taught me was this. Don't overburden the message. Talk to people straight. And he used to say to me all the time, remember, I preach every Sunday, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. When you talk to people, tell them what you are going to do for them, what you will do for their families, and what you will do for their communities. And then stop talking. I think that that's where we you get caught up in all of this stuff. You worry about whether or not you're going to make a headline with some tweet rather than what it takes to make headway. I concentrate on how to make headway, not how to make a headline. And so I say to my caucus all the time, whatever you say to people, you tell them, this is what my policy will do for you. This is what my policy will do for your family. And this is what my policy will do for your community. And when you do that, stop talking.
You mentioned about trimming the message, and when you have close votes in the House, the winning margin, getting to that key number of 218, I know it often comes from competitive districts, places at the margins where Democrats and Republicans compete every cycle. But some members of the caucus who are from more uniform districts, places that are very strongly Democratic, take strong ideas and speak them loudly, which isn't a bad thing, of course. but sometimes they might overestimate the popularity of these ideas, and that can drag down the party nationally. At least I've heard people make that argument in the past. So when it comes to trimming the message and actually getting things done and getting laws passed, how do you manage that dynamic?
Well, that's something that rests with the individual member. You can offer suggestions, as I just have, but it's up to the member to decide whether or not they will follow that advice. Look, when you have a caucus like ours, there's sometimes when you may find that there is disagreement between your voting constituents and those who support your campaign. I find that all the time. But anytime that conflict occurs, I make it known to everybody that I will always err on the side of the voter. You know, to me, that's where you err on. Now, you can't run campaigns without the help, without finance. And so I expect for everybody to do what's necessary to get their message out, but never at the expense of the voter. Because 9 times out of 10, those people who you depend upon to help you finance your reelection or your election will have multiple issues that will come before you. But a lot of times, that low income 35-year-old with 2 children, health care and the need for health care may only visit them one time. Whether or not they get treatment for whatever it is that ails them. I know a lot about that. That wife to whom I was married for 58 years lost a 30-year battle with diabetes 2 years ago. I saw what diabetes can do, and I know what it'll do for people without health insurance. And so what do? So that's the kind of conflict. And I say to the members of my caucus all the time, we got to keep focused on the family. And that's what I do. What do we do for our children and our grandchildren? It's what we want done for everybody else's child and grandchild.
I have one last question, and then we're going to go to the audience. Our first question after this one will go to Emily. But my last question is, you've served in the House for nearly 30 years. You've had an incredible career. And in the course of that time, many of your colleagues may have left the House and gone on to work with industries and lucrative lobbying jobs, but you've chosen to stay and not to do that. So what do you think about colleagues who've made a different decision, or is there anything you'd tell the audience here about how that type of influence works?
Well, the temptation can be great. Several years ago, I was offered an opportunity to lead the Congress, and I was offered a pretty lucrative salary to do so. But I am doing today what I always wanted to do. I was 52 years old when I got elected to Congress. I had given 30 years to state government. I had done things that were necessary to send, in one instance, around between 400 and 500 kids to one university, Wilberforce University, out in Ohio, kids from rural communities in the Sea Islands of South Carolina. I've done this, and to me, public service is my calling. I always want to pay the bills. I wanted to be able to educate my children. I was able to pay the bills, able to educate my children. I can't take anything else when I leave this earth. So I've had a pretty good life. I'm on people who want to be millionaires. I want to help them be millionaires. I've just never had that kind of interest.
moving to audience question and answer. For the first question, we'd like to go to a good friend of the show, Emily Wilkins. She's a reporter. She's the congressional and campaigns reporter for Bloomberg Government. Emily, we're always happy and grateful to see you here. What would you like to ask the congressman today?
Oh no, thank you guys so much for doing this, Congressman. Really appreciate your insights here. I imagine, Congressman, you're going to get a number of questions today on how progress is going on that big reconciliation bill. And so I wanted to take a minute and ask you quickly about the debt limit. Right now, Congress has averted at this point having the government default on its debts on October 18th, but you guys now have a December 3rd deadline to get to. Republicans are still adamant that they're not going to be joining with Democrats on passing a legislation to raise that debt limit. And I had sort of a two-part question. Number one, do you think it's time for Democrats to just go it alone, use the reconciliation process, just get the debt limit done so we're not facing another cliff? And I also wanted to see if you think that Democrats should not just be worried about raising the debt limit, but should try to do something within reconciliation to actually eliminate the debt limit altogether so Congress no longer has to have these fights every few years. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for that question. It's a great question. And let me thank you, whoever's doing the recognizing here. Emily is a great name. That happened to have been the name of my late wife that I just talked about. So I have a preference for Emily's. So thank you for that. Look, I'm all for eliminating this debt limit. I don't think we have any business with it. I've been advocating that for a long time. I'm on the bill with Bill Foster has got a bill that eliminates the debt limit. Brendan Boyle has a bill that modifies the debt limit. I think, what's his name? Jerry Nadler, I believe, has legislation. I told my staff, I want to be on every bill that gets rid of the debt limit. And now, if they are not going to work with us, and the Republicans want to do those things that will most certainly ruin the full faith and credit of the United States of America, then let's hold them out to the country as being in that camp. But if necessary, let's put this debt limit in this reconciliation bill right now and get rid of the debt limit. That's what we ought to do, because I believe that anytime you appropriate monies, you are establishing the limit of your financial obligations and responsibility. And you need to pay the bills that you're responsible for getting. Another thing my dad used to tell me all the time, that the greatest thing in our financial marketing, he said, is credit. Keep your credit good. You can't pay cash for everything that you want to own, buying a car, buying a house. But he used to say to me all the time, you keep your credit good. And I followed his advice with that also.
Thank you, Congressman. And thank you for the question, Emily from Bloomberg. It's really great to see you. And you do have a great name. I agree. Let's go next to Donna. And then after Donna, let's go to Eric Foster. Donna?
Hi, thank you, Jeff, and thank you, Congressman Clyburn. I'm Donna Patterson, a professor and department chair at Delaware State University. And I was really happy to hear you talk about inequity and broadband and Wi-Fi access, both in rural and urban areas. But I want to pivot to HBCUs. I know the Biden administration has pledged $4 billion to HBCUs in upcoming years. Now, there's a lot of inequity in HBCUs, both in terms of funding that they've gotten historically, but also between different institutions. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, thank you very much for that. I'm going to be kind to you today, but I don't expect for South Carolina State to be too kind to Delaware State very soon. I think it's a couple of weeks from now. But did you know I'm a graduate of South Carolina State? That was the campus I was on when I met my late wife. I have a daughter who's a graduate of Benedict College. I'm as big a proponent of historical black colleges and universities that you find anywhere. I was on the point, and I want nobody's talking about this, but we have just forgiven $1.6 billion in debt. And I looked at the number, and I won't say it if you want to say it, it's fine with me. I looked at Delaware State's number just last night. And so I know how much debt that we forgave Delaware State this year. I know how much money was in the KS package, KS1 and KS2 for Delaware State and all the other HBCUs. Now, everybody is talking about that $4 billion or $2 billion. I've even seen all kinds of tweets out there giving us a lot of just foolishness because we've cut HBCUs by $30 billion. That's what's out there on the internet. That's not true. It never was true. Tuesday afternoon during the vote, I sat on the floor with Bobby Scott, who chairs this committee, the Education and Labor Committee. And we have funded HBCUs to great lengths more than anybody has ever done. And I remember the previous administration, the 45, boasting about what he did for HBCUs. You know what he did? He took the money that we passed in the House from one section of the budget, put it in the permanent section of the budget, and claimed that he got all that money for HBCUs. The money was in the budget all the time. He just moved it over to another line. That's good for it to be in the permanent section of the budget. But he didn't increase it by one dime. So that's the kind of thing that leads to all kinds of problems out here. So all this stuff I've been seeing in recent days, and I've been talking about all week, about what we have not done for HBCUs, we have done it, and we are still doing it. And this $4 billion is nothing. I want you to go back and look and see who has been restoring all of these historic buildings on the campuses of historical black colleges and universities. Ask the people over at up at John C. Smith how they retrofitted and brought back online Biddle Auditorium. Allen University, Arnett Hall was boarded up for 30 years. For 30 years, it was boarded up. Couldn't get rid of it because it was a historic building. They couldn't tear it down. Didn't have the money to renovate it. It was Jim Clyburn, under the authorization of the chair of the caucus at the time, Maxine Waters, that started this program. Go down to Voorhees College, Massachusetts Hall. All over this country, we're doing it. I'm committed to historical black colleges and universities, and I'm going to stay committed to them because they serve a useful purpose. And let me close with this on this subject. When I didn't ask him, he came by my office just before he went up on this fatal flight, Ron McNair. Ron McNair said to me, he said, people always introduce me as this PhD in physics from MIT, but had it not been for North Carolina A&T, where I had teachers and professors and administrators who understood what it was like to grow up in a little town like Lake City, South Carolina, a little tobacco town where I was not able to use the library when I was growing up. And when I got to that campus, they nurtured me and they turned me in to what I am today. That's what HBCUs are all about all over this country. And I'm glad to see that they are getting this tremendous resurgence thanks to the newly elected Vice President of the United States, who happens to be Howard University Bison graduate, and of course, Cedric Richmond from Morehouse College. Yours truly from South Carolina State. But last year, we have bulldogs at South Carolina State, but I told everybody everywhere I went, until November, I'm a Howard University Bison.
Next, I would like to go to Eric Foster. Then after Eric Foster, we'll go to Mary. And then after Mary, we have a constituent here to ask you a question. Eric Foster, over to you. What would you like to ask the Congressman today?
Thank you, Congressman Clyburn, for being on. And as my maternal family's lineage is Hemingsway, South Carolina, Presley's and Wilson's, I know that you, and they've always been very supportive of you from my family down there. So here's my question, though. It relates to voting rights and the voting rights legislation. A couple things. One, are we missing the mark in the legislation by not trying to go back and address the decoupling of voting and citizenship, which took place in the US v. Reese, US v. Harris, Slaughterhouse, Kershank cases, and that as a part of what we're doing through legislation, we should try to recouple voting as it was intended in the 14th and 15th Amendments to be a tie bar, citizenship and voting as a national right, not a state grant. And then also, do we miss the mark by not talking about how the Republicans are trying to prevent not just us from voting, but also white Democrats, white independents, white liberal, white third-party candidate voters to just limit it to their voting constituencies? Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. That's a very good question. I'm very familiar with the 1872 Cruikshank case, which I credit with starting us in this cascading downwardly to separate but equal, which, as you know, did not really get set in stone until Plessy versus Ferguson, 1896, 98, all of which stayed the law of the land from 1862, codifying Jim Crow, all the way up to 1954 Brown v. Board of Education decision. But I'm not too sure that decoupling the two is a good idea. I think they're one and the same. The 14th Amendment gave the former slaves equal protection of the law, and of course the 15th granted the right to vote. So you look at those together, they were separate, and over time we have sort of merged these things with various pieces of legislation. But let me say this: I feel very strongly that when it comes to voting rights and constitutional rights, we ought not have those rights subjected to the filibuster. I have not asked Joe Manchin or Kristen Sinema or anybody else to get rid of their beliefs in the filibuster, though I know deep down inside that if given the opportunity, the Republicans will throw, if it were 50-50 in their favor with a president, Republican president, they'll scuttle the filibuster in a skinny minute, as we say down in Hemingway, South Carolina. And I do know the Wilsons. I don't know if W.B. Wilson from down there is a relative of yours, but I know them very, very well. Williamsburg County is a very important part of my constituency, and thank you so much for the question. But I do believe that we need to decouple voting from this filibuster, all other constitutional issues. No one person ought to be able to determine whether or not I have the right to vote or whether or not my vote count. Now, another thing that you said that I want everybody to focus on here, this ain't just about Black folks. The law they passed down in Georgia allows a partisan committee to overturn or to nullify the results of the election. If they nullify the results of election down in Georgia, they have nullified the votes of a lot of Black people, but they have nullified the votes of a lot of white people, more white people than Black people. So that's what people need to understand. If we fool around and let these laws pass and get set in stone, allowing the nullification. Remember Martin Luther King Jr.'s speech in Washington? Everybody talk about I have a dream. But look at the last part of that speech. He says, he called upon everybody. He says, I'm going to return to the South. Let's go back to the South where governors' lips are sprouting into position and nullification. He warned us back then about nullification. It's all coming to the fore today. So when you nullify the results of an election, you have nullified the votes of more white people than black people.
Thank you, Congressman, for the answer. Next, we have a constituent, Jalen Elrod, third vice chair of the South Carolina Democratic Party and a graduate of the Congressman James E. Clyburn Fellowship. Jalen, thank you for being here. What would you like to ask the Congressman today?
Thank you for taking the time, and thank you, Congressman, for being on here. Congressman, I'm one of your constituents, as the gentleman said, and one of the things I wanted to ask you is that specifically here in South Carolina, what do you think we need to do to get more congressmen like you that will fight for our values and for the progress in our state, as opposed to some of your colleagues on the Republican side who have been elected in this state who might not be as forthright as you are in terms of what we need in this state? Thank you.
Well, thank you for the question, and thank you, John, for your service to the party. I just want you to know that I just talked with the chair of the party last week, and I got some honorary for doing something, and I sent it all to the South Carolina Democratic Party. We cannot accept honorary, as you know, as members of Congress. So I gave a pretty good chunk of change to the South Carolina Democratic Party in order to keep the Clyburn Fellowship going. And I'm going to write you another check next week. So let me say this. I think that what we've got to do is spend a little more time focusing on the kinds of things you all do with this fellowship program. I think we're now in the 5th class of fellows. And I thank Jamie Harrison, who's now the national chair, for bringing that fellowship online, because it is there that you learn a lot about politics. My own daughter told me that she thought she knew stuff in our house, but when she became a Clyburn Fellow, the stuff you all taught her there taught her how much she did not know. So what we've got to do is start at the bottom, start at the base. A lot of people confuse what they see on television or hear on the radio with being politics. No, politics is much more fundamental than that. And the fundamentals of politics, you all are doing a good job of training people now. I tell Bishop John Wright, who is a fellow, I talk to a lot, and Caldwell of, what's his name, from, I don't know why I'm blocking his name now, but just with him yesterday working on the campaign, from over there in Dalton, whose mother and father I knew very well. I just think that we just have to spend a little time over the next several years training people about the fundamentals of this stuff and getting us to a good place so that when we run for office, that we will run for office not just over the whim, but be able to understand how to address the people we're talking to. In my book, I made the epilogue to the book, an open letter to my children and grandchildren and all other children similarly situated. And I said in that letter that if you plan to open a business, get to know the people you want to sell your service or your goods to. And if you want to go into politics, get to know the people that you want to vote for you. I think that the big mistake that so many people in politics make is trying to make themselves over every time they meet a different group. You learn it seems to me that I don't care what color you are, I don't care what gender you are, I don't care what station in life you might be. You're going to get the same message from me all the time. I don't try to make myself over for anybody. But what I do try to do is learn who I'm talking to. I want to learn about banking if I'm going to talk to bankers. You know, I'm going to learn about real estate if I'm going to talk to realtors. I want to learn about farming if I'm going to talk to farmers. So whatever it is, get to know the people that you want to ask to vote for you. That's just the way it is. And I think y'all doing a good job of that with the Clyburn Fellows. And I'm going to do everything I can to keep that program going. After next week, you'll be good, at least for another 2 years.
So next up, I'd like to go to John Gunnison, who's one of our moderators here. John Gunnison, over to you.
Thank you so much for being with us, Congressman. It seems to me that the story of the Democratic caucus right now is the story about competing priorities. There was so much that was promised and discussed as possibilities during campaigns, and such a limit of bandwidth, prioritization, and legislative calendar to fit in everything that members want to get done. And I'm wondering if gun control is becoming lost in the shuffle. I want to understand where it fits in the hierarchy of priorities and what we see as the real possibility that some kind of legislative action can happen on gun control before the 2022 elections. Thank you.
Well, to be honest with you, I do not see any way for us to address that issue before 2022. There's no way in the world that in the House or Senate, you're going to get the 51 in the Senate or the 218 in the House on any kind of legislation relating to gun control. Though I'm not particular like to use that term because nobody wants to control guns. What we really want to do is deal with gun safety and making sure that we keep the guns out of the hands of people who we should not have them. That's what happened with the Emanuel 9. And that's why I've been pushing this so-called Charleston loophole, closing that Charleston loophole. That young man that got that gun had no business with a gun. He had a record in his background that would prevent him from getting a gun. He killed 9 people in a prayer service. Bible study. He killed them because of his racism, because of his worshiping of the Confederate battle flag. Now, if they did not have that 3-day limit on background check, they would have found, because I'm told it was around the 5th day, that they saw that he shouldn't have had the gun, but he already had the gun. And I've done the research on this. The hundreds of people who have purchased guns because of that 3-day limit, that if there were more time to check for what may be errors of the misspelling of a name, or entering the wrong street address, or in West Columbia, South Carolina, rather than Columbia, South Carolina, which I think is what happened in this particular case. We need to do that. We need to have this background check that Mike Thompson bill is trying to address. Mike Thompson from California. So will we do it between now and 2022? I don't think so. Can we do it after 2022 if we get a significant vote for Democrats in the House and the Senate? I think we could. But I don't think we'll do anything on this between now and 2022.
Thank you, Congressman, and thank you for the question. So my last question would be, is there anything you want to leave our audience with, either good, bad, or anything in between? Any last messages that you think we should keep in mind?
Yes, I do. 2 things. The first one is be sure to tell Carlton that I did remember his name. I was having a senior moment when I did not remember his name up front. But the last thing I want to say is this. The Pledge of Allegiance that all of us learn very early ends with a very significant vision, with liberty and justice for all. I have held on to that since I first learned it. And I've made it a part of the pledge that I make to the American people, especially my constituents, every time I run for office. this is a great country. Does not have to be made great again. Our challenge is to make the greatness of this country accessible and affordable for all. If it's healthcare, make it accessible and affordable. If it's education, accessible and affordable. Broadband, accessible and affordable. You name it. Housing, accessible and affordable. That's what the challenge is, making the greatness of this country accessible and affordable for all of its citizens. And so I will call upon everyone within the earshot today to please think about that as you go through life. Ask yourself every morning, what can I do to make the greatness of this country accessible and affordable for the people with whom I come in contact? If we do that, we will determine to a large extent just what the greatness of this country is all about.
That's all we have for you today. Again, huge thanks to Congressman Clyburn for coming out, to our audience for their questions, and to you for being here. If you like or dislike what you hear, if you want to find past episodes, find out how to join us live almost every day of the week, or maybe ask one of our upcoming guests a question, please visit our website, pm101.live or pm101.club. They both work and will get you to the same place where you can find all that and more. This has been Politics and Media 101. I'm Jeff Browning, and on behalf of Justin Higgins, our co-founder, and our team, thank you very much for being here. We hope to see you and hear from you soon.